Building a family through IVF, well, it's such a personal journey, isn't it? And often quite challenging for so many of you listening.
It really is. And along that path, you often hear about this technique, pre-implantation genetic testing for aneuploidy, PGTA.
Exactly. It gets presented as this, powerful tool, something that can screen embryos for chromosomal issues.
Right. Potentially boost your IVF success rates, maybe even help prevent conditions like Down syndrome. It sounds incredibly promising.
It does. But as we've been digging through, quite a stack of sources, clinical trials, medical journals, legal papers, expert views, a much more complex picture starts to emerge.
Definitely. So our mission today is really to pull out the most important nuggets from all this material, equip you with the crucial info.
And some of it is quite contradictory, actually, so you can be truly well informed about PGTA.
Let's start where patients often start. Big promises.
Okay. So PGTA gets pitched on some really compelling claims, right?
Number one, preventing birth defects like Down syndrome. That's a big one, especially for older women who, understandably, worry about that.
And it's also marketed heavily as a way to sort of weed out non-viable embryos.
The idea being that it improves your overall IVF success rates, theoretically.
And let's be honest here, sometimes it's used discreetly for sex selection too.
Yeah, often kind of hidden under the excuse of preventing genetic problems.
But what's striking is how quickly these claims start to look shaky when you compare them to what, reputable independent groups are saying.
Absolutely. Like the United Kingdom, they've basically given PGTA a red light rating.
Or a red light. Why?
They specifically point to doubtful data about whether it actually improves IVF success at all.
And that's not just one opinion, is it? The American Society for Reproductive Medicine, ASRM.
Right, a major body in the U.S. They explicitly say they do not recommend the broad application of PGTA on all IVF patients.
Why not? Same reason.
Pretty much. They also mention doubtful results on improving live birth rates. And they say its effect on lowering miscarriage risk. Well, that remains unclear.
Wow. That's quite a strong caution from such a major professional group.
It is. And this isn't just, academic debate. These warnings have real-world teeth. We're seeing it in court.
You mean the lawsuits?
Exactly. There are ongoing lawsuits against PGTA right now in the USA. Plaintiffs saying they were misled.
Misled into doing what?
Into discarding potentially viable embryos based on the test results. And we saw that huge settlement in Australia, too.
Oh, right. The $56 million compensation agreement for similar issues, wasn't it?
Yes. It really drives home the human cost when things go wrong.
Okay, so hearing about these red flags, these lawsuits, the next logical step is the science. What do the big clinical trials actually show?
Good question. Because there have been multiple large-scale studies that really challenge the marketing narrative.
So let's unpack those. Where should we start?
Let's start with the ESTEEM trial. That was back in 2018. A big multi-center trial run by ESHA, the European Society for Human Reproduction and Embryology.
Okay, big European study. What did they look at?
9 IVF centers, 7 countries, nearly 400 women aged 36 to 40. Pretty robust.
And the results? Published in Human Reproduction, I see.
The conclusion was clear. PGTA did not increase cumulative live birth rates in IVF. Simple as that.
Didn't increase them at all.
No. The lead author, Professor Karen Sermon, even said she saw no benefit in offering it to older women, especially if they didn't get many eggs.
Okay, one major trial showing no benefit. Was that just a one-off?
Apparently not. The very next year, 2019, we got the STAR trial. Similar findings.
STAR trial. Tell me about that one.
Another large, multi-center randomized trial. This time 34 centers across the U.S., Canada, UK, Australia, over 600 patients aged 24 to 40.
And they use the latest tech, right? Next-generation sequencing.
Yes, specifically Illumina's Verisec PGS, so top-of-the-line testing for its time.
And published in Fertility and Sterility, ASRM's own journal. What did they find?
The lead author, Dr. Santiago Mune from Yale, reported no significant overall improvement in IVF success rates with PGTA.
So 2 major trials, different continents, different research groups, latest tech, same basic message, no clear improvement.
And the hits kept coming. 2021, another big multi-center trial, this time from China.
It's China. How big was this one?
14 IVF centers, over 1,200 patients. Published in the New England Journal of Medicine, another top journal.
Don't tell me. Similar results.
You guessed it. They reported similar results on the insignificant effects of PGTA in improving IVF success rates.
This is building quite a case against the effectiveness claims. Is there anything more recent?
Yes, and this one is maybe even more concerning. A big study published in 2023, Not a trial, but an analysis.
An analysis of what?
Over 133,000 IVF cycles from the U.S. SART database. Huge amount of data.
SART, that's the Society for Assisted Reproductive Technology, so real-world data from clinics. What did that show?
It found that using PGTA was actually associated with a lower cumulative live birth rate than routine IVF for patients who had good embryos, blastocysts available.
Lower, not just no improvement, but actually worse outcomes.
Potentially, yes. And interestingly, this negative association was especially pronounced in patients below 35 years old.
Younger patients, that seems counterintuitive.
It does, though they didn't see that negative link in women 40 and over, but still, for the younger group.
That's really significant. The lead author, Dr. Kucherov, and Dr. Norbert Gleicher commented on this too, didn't they?
Yes, Dr. Gleicher's comment was pretty blunt. He said something like, we had reached a dead end for the PGTA technique.
A dead end. Wow, that's a strong statement after looking at so much data.
It really is. So you've got this growing body of independent, large-scale evidence from all over the world consistently saying PGTA doesn't broadly improve IVF success.
Okay, we've laid out the clinical evidence, and it really does seem to contradict the marketing. So the massive question is, why?
Right. What's going on technically, biologically? Why this huge gap between the promise and the reality?
Where does the problem lie?
Well, a lot of it seems to come down to the basic method, how the test is actually done.
Okay, like what?
First, there's a fundamental sampling issue. PGTA tests cells taken from the outer layer of the embryo.
The trophectoderm.
Exactly. That layer goes on to form the placenta and the umbilical cord.
Okay.
So here's the critical point. That outer layer is not representative of the inner embryo layer, the inner cell mass.
Which is the part that actually becomes the baby.
Precisely. So testing the outer layer might give you results that don't accurately reflect the genetics of the actual future baby.
Yeah.
You can get inconclusive or even misleading results.
So you're basically testing the box and assuming it perfectly matches the gift inside, even though they develop differently.
That's a good analogy. It's a potential flaw right at the core of the technique.
And it's not exactly a gentle process either, taking that sample.
No, definitely not. It involves drilling a hole through the embryo's shell, the zona pellucida.
Drilling a hole.
Yes. And then extracting cells for the testing. That's the biopsy part. It's a highly invasive technique.
And potentially harmful.
Yes, potentially harmful. It can impair its development. Now, some studies say there are no ill effects. But critics point out those studies often use only the best quality, really robust embryos. They might not reflect what happens to more delicate, lower quality embryos.
Which might suffer more from the biopsy.
Exactly. And who tends to have fewer lower quality embryo?
Older women, often.
Right. So the very embryos you might think need testing could be the ones most vulnerable to damage by biopsy. It's catch-22.
So the procedure itself might harm the embryos it's supposed to be helping select? That's tricky. And what about human error? It sounds delicate.
It is extremely delicate. And despite highly trained lab staff, there is still a risk of human error. It happens.
Especially under pressure.
You could argue that yes. The more busy the IVF lab is, the greater the risk of human error, as lab staff are under pressure to complete procedures as fast as possible.
Okay, sampling issues, potential harm from the biopsy, human error. But then there's this other huge piece, isn't there? The aha moment, you called it.
Yes. This is where it gets really interesting. Mosaic embryos.
Mosaic embryos. Explain those for us.
So mosaic embryos are embryos that have a mixture of cells. Some are genetically normal, some are abnormal.
A mix. How common is that?
Actually quite frequent. Really common among women doing IVF.
Okay, so what's the problem with PGTA and mosaic embryos?
The big problem is that PGTA, because it only samples a few cells, often leads to the misdiagnosis and discarding of mosaic embryos. They get labeled as abnormal.
But are they truly non-viable?
Well, here's the crucial part, the real game changer. These mosaic embryos have been shown to be capable of giving rise to a normal and healthy baby.
Wait, even with some abnormal cells, they can still become healthy babies. How?
It's fascinating. There's strong scientific evidence that these embryos can self-correct.
Self-correct? What does that mean?
It seems they can essentially push out the genetically abnormal cells into the outer embryo layer, the part that becomes the placenta leaving the inner cells, the ones forming the baby, genetically normal.
Wow. So the embryo itself can kind of clean things up. That's incredible resilience.
It really is. But think about the implication.
If you're discarding these mosaic embryos based on PGTA.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Especially for, say, an older woman with low ovarian reserve who only has a few embryos to begin with.
Discarding a mosaic embryo could drastically reduce her chances.
It would, in fact, substantially reduce their chances of IVF success, because that embryo might have been the one. Some women end up with no embryos left to transfer after genetic testing.
After going through all that expense and procedure, 0 embryos left. That's devastating.
It absolutely is.
Yeah.
And this directly links those scientific doubts we talked about to these heartbreaking real-world consequences.
Which explains why we're seeing these legal challenges. You mentioned the class action lawsuits in the U.S.
Yes, ongoing suits. Some lawyers are even calling PGTA the most glaring and widespread example of fraud within the IVF landscape. Very strong words.
Who are they targeting?
Law firms like Berger Montague are going after several big genetic testing companies. Cooper Genomics, Cooper Surgical, Progenesis, Natera, among others.
And the core allegation
That these companies provided misleading information regarding the accuracy of PGTA testing. Essentially, consumer fraud and breach of warranty.
They're saying crucial info wasn't shared with patients.
Yes, that essential information was not disclosed to vulnerable patients, which raises huge ethical questions about transparency and, patient autonomy.
And the lawsuits specifically mention these false negatives, right? Where viable mosaic embryos are wrongly flagged as unsuitable.
Exactly. Leading to them being discarded, causing emotional distress, and obviously reducing the chances of pregnancy.
What are the plaintiffs asking for?
They want their out-of-pocket costs spent on PGTA back, plus other damages, including punitive damages for the emotional and psychological distress.
You hear quotes from the lawyers involved. Paula Bliss talking about consequential decisions based on PGTA testing that was falsely marketed.
Right. And Allison Freeman, another lawyer who actually went through fertility treatments herself, talks about holding an industry accountable, an industry increasingly guided by financial gain, especially when patients are at their most vulnerable state.
And Shannon Carson emphasizing litigating these vital cases, calling the practices gross violations of the core principles of the healthcare industry, including non-maleficence and first, do no harm.
Pretty damning language, and it echoes what happened in Australia.
Right, that Monash IVF case. $56 million paid out to over 700 patients.
Because of inaccurate and salty genetic testing that led to potentially viable embryos being destroyed, the lawsuit really highlighted the heartbreaking consequences and unresolved grief.
And all this against the backdrop of the cost.
Which is significant. PGTA can cost several $1,000s, and it's typically not covered by insurance in the U.S.
Yet its use has skyrocketed.
Dramatically, from about 13% of IVF cycles in 2014 to around 40% by 2021.
That's hundreds of millions in revenue for the testing companies.
A massive financial incentive for a procedure with, as we've seen, very questionable benefits and potential harms.
So patients are paying thousands out of pocket, potentially lowering their chances.
Yeah.
It's really concerning.
It is. And this brings us to another layer, how PGTA gets adopted and used in different places, driven by more than just pure medical need.
Like the Malaysia case study we looked at.
Exactly. In Malaysia, you see clinics aggressively market PGTA specifically to older women, playing on fears about Down syndrome.
But there's another angle there too, isn't there? The sex selection aspect.
Yes, that's a big one.
Yeah.
PGTA is apparently being discreetly used by IVF patients as a sex selection technique.
With the Down syndrome prevention being used as a cover story.
A convenient excuse or cover-up, as our sources put it, even though the Malaysian Medical Association strongly discourages sex selection for non-medical reasons.
PGTA is basically the best tool for it.
Currently, the best and most effective method of sex selection available, yeah. Almost 100% success rate for choosing gender, which obviously raises huge ethical concerns, especially in a diverse country like Malaysia.
How does this play into medical tourism?
Well, because many nearby countries, like China and India, have actually banned the use of PGTA, for embryo sex selection.
Why did they ban it?
Concerns about skewing sex ratios, reinforcing gender bias, those sorts of social issues.
So it bans elsewhere.
Malaysia has kind of emerged as a medical tourism hub for such a controversial procedure. They offer competitive fees.
And people come from other countries specifically for this.
Yes. There were news reports of couples from Singapore coming here for embryo sex selection, which then led Singapore to put severe restrictions on importing embryos tested this way.
Interesting. And who are these medical tourists, typically?
Sources say many patients seeking sex selection are ethnic Chinese from Singapore and China. They prefer Malaysia partly for cheaper medical fees and because they can find Mandarin-speaking doctors.
And this ties into cultural factors.
Deeply. It's linked to the son or male preference and obsession with having male heirs that is strongly ingrained in traditional Chinese culture.
So it's this complex mix of technology, cost, and deep-seated cultural desires driving demand.
Absolutely. And beyond tourism, there are local factors in Malaysia pushing PGTA uptake too.
Like what?
Well, first, there's a lack of legal clarity regarding the abortion of fetuses diagnosed with abnormalities. Services are limited, expensive, so testing before implantation seems safer.
Okay, that makes sense. What else?
Religious beliefs are powerful. The prevailing view among all major religious faiths in Malaysia is that abortion is immoral, so people want to avoid that possibility.
And social stigma.
Huge factor. Congenital defects and genetic conditions such as Down syndrome are heavily stigmatized. Plus, there are limited facilities available that provide care and education for disabled children.
So parents feel immense pressure to have a perfect child.
Sadly, yes.
Yeah.
Add to that, younger educated women are more aware that advancing maternal age is associated with a greater risk of genetic defects, more anxiety.
And smaller families overall.
Right. The decrease in family sizes means parents tend to invest more in fewer children, which can include paying for expensive genetic tests like PGTA.
Which, as we know, can add significantly to the cost.
Easily 20 to 30% to the total IVF cost. And the worrying thing is, patients making these choices are often ignorant of all the international warnings and lawsuits we've just discussed.
It's a real convergence, isn't it? Financial incentives for clinics and companies, patient vulnerability and fear, plus these powerful sociocultural drivers, all pushing towards using this test without perhaps full understanding.
It's a potent mix.
Okay, so after diving deep into all of this, the science, the ethics, the lawsuits, the social factors, what are the absolute key takeaways for you, the listener?
If you're considering IVF and PGTA is offered, what do you really need to know before deciding?
First, I'd say you really should think twice before choosing to add on this highly expensive and invasive technique.
Absolutely. Know the strong scientific evidence. Multiple large trials worldwide showing PGTA doesn't consistently improve IVF success or live birth rates.
And it might even lower them for certain groups, particularly younger women.
Remember the invasiveness. The biopsy itself carries a risk of harm, especially for more delicate, lower-quality embryos.
And crucially, that huge risk of misdiagnosing and discarding mosaic embryos.
Embryos that could potentially become your healthy baby. That's a massive factor to weigh.
Then there's the cost. Thousands of dollars, likely out of pocket, a huge financial burden on top of everything else.
And don't ignore the legal context. Those ongoing international lawsuits alleging misleading marketing, fraud, lack of transparency about risks. That's serious.
So patients really need to be warned about U.S. lawsuits. They deserve comprehensive information related to the risks and limitations associated with PGTA, not just the potential benefits.
Completely agree. And maybe it would even be prudent to require patients considering PGTA to consult with a certified genetic counselor.
Why a genetic counselor specifically?
To really enhance their understanding of the complex risks involved and whether adding PGTA is truly justified for their specific situation in their IVF treatment.
So wrapping this up, PGTA, it holds out a promise, but our deep dive really shows it's incredibly complex, highly controversial.
Yeah, significant doubts about its widely advertised benefits, and these are compounded by really serious ethical and legal concerns playing out across the globe.
It really underscores the absolute importance of patient autonomy, making sure you have the full picture to make a truly informed decision about your reproductive health.
It's all about empowerment through knowledge.
So here's a final thought to leave you with. In a world buzzing with new scientific possibilities, what does this whole PGTA story suggest about the responsibility of the healthcare industry?
Especially regarding complete transparency, when patients are often navigating one of the most vulnerable and hopeful times in their lives. Something to ponder.